Hey guys, tonight we step softly into the frost-bitten world of Viking symbols, where the air smells faintly of smoked fish, pine resin, and the lingering tang of seawater. You trudge over uneven cobblestones that weren't cobbled at all, just packed dirt, hardened by centuries of boots and hooves, and notice the faint scratches in the stone's runes, whispering their meanings half-finished like someone started a thought and got distracted by a goat. You probably won't survive this without a blanket or a cup of warm tea, because we're about to wander through icy forests, long ships, and the tiny, carved sticks of a writing system that was both magical and utterly mundane. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, post your location and local time. I love knowing where in the world my fellow rune listeners are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin by noticing the simplest of runes, the Elder Futhark. Each symbol is jagged and abrupt, carved into wood or bone with deliberate effort, like someone had only half a mind to finish a thought. The lines seem harsh in the firelight, yet the letters carry a softness when you whisper them aloud. Historians still argue whether these symbols were influenced more by Mediterranean scripts or were purely a northern invention, and for now it doesn't matter. You feel the thrill of holding an idea older than most nations. A curious thing about runes is how ordinary they were. You might imagine Vikings only scratching them onto swords before a battle or into stone for immortality, but everyday people used them to mark tools, tally livestock, or leave directions for travelers. One scholar once found a carved stick that read something like, "Odin hates the stew tonight," which makes you wonder if Vikings had passive-aggressive note-writing centuries before post-its. These inscriptions weren't always neat. Some were hurried crooked or just abandoned mid-carving. Magic and practicality intertwine like threads in a tapestry. Some runes were believed to offer protection, luck, or revenge, carved in quiet corners of homes or even on ships. You can almost hear the hushed voices chanting their meanings, hoping the spirits of the forest or perhaps the neighbors take notice. Yet the same symbols could record mundane events, a trade agreement, a farm tally, or an inventory of stolen pigs. The duality of the runes, sacred and practical, is one reason modern scholars keep debating their exact purpose. As you trace the runes with your eyes, you notice small details, notches indicating counts, little dots marking syllables, an extra line here or there that might be a signature or a doodle. Some of these marks are lost to time, barely visible under lichen or worn wood, giving the impression of a language mid-thought, unfinished, like a letter never sent. The idea is oddly comforting. Even a culture renowned for raids, long ships and fierce warriors left moments of human hesitation, tiny cracks where daily life peeked through. You imagine walking into a Viking home. The smoke from a central hearth curls up and out a thatched roof, carrying the smell of cooking and ash. In the corner, a young Viking scratches symbols onto a wooden spoon, perhaps recording a favorite recipe or a curse on a sibling who stole it last week. The spoon is practical, but the runes whisper a private meaning, a secret layer to everyday objects. You smile at the thought. Even in the harsh North, people found ways to personalize their world quietly. Then there's the landscape itself. Stones by the roadside bear runes, some commemorating journeys, battles, or deaths. Others are almost invisible, hidden under moss or barely etched, as if the carver lost interest mid-thought. Scholars debate whether these incomplete carvings were intentional, magical, unfinished works, or simply the result of distraction, wear, or impatience. You, however, like to think Vikings occasionally got bored or realized they forgot lunch, leaving their runes dangling in suspense. You notice the rhythm of the marks, how certain lines repeat, how the symmetry varies, and how even abandoned carvings carry aesthetic weight. Some runes seem carefully planned with strokes that mirror each other perfectly, while others zigzag wildly, probably after one too many mugs of mead. Historians still argue whether this variation reflects personal style, regional dialects, or different intended meanings. For now, you just breathe it in, letting the shapes float in your mind like slow snowflakes. Runes weren't just for humans. You find one carved on a gatepost with small pictographs nearby, perhaps a charm to protect the livestock. Another marks a boundary between farms. Even the simplest scratches carry the sense that someone thought carefully about the world around them, leaving a coded message you can't entirely read. There's a quiet thrill in imagining you might be the first outsider to notice centuries later a half-finished spell or an unimportant tally that still resonates. Even in their unfinished state, runes speak. They hint at rituals, journeys, and daily life bridging time in a way that feels almost alive. You can almost hear whispers, "Remember me," or "Don't forget your chores," or "I tried." Each scratch is a frozen breath, a human intention captured mid-air. You realize the magic isn't just in carved symbols, but in the persistence of curiosity. Whoever you are tonight, you're listening, and the runes have reached across a millennium to murmur to you. And so the first whispers wrap around you like a soft blanket. You are in the Viking world, not raiding, not sailing, just observing, feeling, and hearing the runes that still murmur in their unfinished way. The smell of pine and fire lingers, the soft scratch of carving feels tactile in your mind, and even the silence between marks carries meaning. It's slow, meditative, and if you let it, deeply calming. You lean back, perhaps adjusting your pillow or sipping tea, aware that the whispers are patient. They will still be here when you look closer, when you return to the marks, when you remember the tiny details that make history quietly human. You trudge along a narrow trail that cuts through a misty pine forest, feeling the damp needles underfoot and hearing the soft drip of melting frost. The Elder Futhark runes you saw last night begin to stir in your imagination, and you wonder where they came from, how someone first decided that a set of jagged lines could capture words, ideas, or magic. Runic origins remain shrouded in mystery, like footprints fading in wet sand, and historians still argue whether Vikings borrowed letters from Mediterranean alphabets or if these symbols arose purely from Proto-Germanic creativity. It's one of those debates that seems never-ending but comforting in its persistence, scholars quietly squabbling over something that to you feels alive and immediate. You notice the first traces in Scandinavia, etched into bone fragments, wooden sticks, and occasional stone markers. The runes appear practical, tallying livestock, labeling personal belongings, or recording journeys. But already you glimpse a hint of ritual, a subtle curve here, or a mysterious dot there that feels more than functional. Fringe historians like to speculate wildly, claiming some runes were inspired by celestial patterns or even shamanic visions, though most mainstream scholars politely roll their eyes. You can imagine a lone Viking gazing at the stars, inspired to carve a symbol, not just for counting, but to honor the unknown forces overhead. As you walk, your mind drifts to the evolution of these marks. Early runes, Elder Futhark, contained 24 characters each, carefully shaped, each with a name and symbolic meaning. Later, younger Futhark shrank to 16, a simplification that suggests both practical efficiency and evolving language. You can almost hear a Viking tutor mumbling, "Fewer letters, fewer mistakes," while a pupil pokes the stick into the dirt, marking it with tentative scratches. Historians still argue whether these changes were primarily linguistic, cultural, or even mystical. Sometimes runes appear where you least expect them. You pause by a riverbank and notice a carved stick wedged between rocks, its lines half eroded by water and ice. The carving seems impatient, unfinished, like someone had been interrupted mid-thought, perhaps by a sudden idea to fish, or a goat chewing their cloak, or just a fleeting distraction. This is the quirk of runes, even their incompleteness tells a story. Some runes were abandoned mid-carving because of superstition. Perhaps the wrong symbol could summon misfortune. Other times they were simply overlooked mundane objects left to weather the centuries. You hear the soft crunch of your boots over frost as you imagine runes spreading across the land. Traders, raiders, and travelers carried them from fjord to forest to river, leaving inscriptions that marked everything from property boundaries to subtle love notes, or in the case of one cheeky fragment, a complaint about spoiled fish. The mobility of runes fascinates you. Lines scratched on bone in Norway could appear on stones in Britain decades later. Historians still argue whether the spread was primarily practical, like language for trade, or whether runes carried mystical weight transforming as they moved. You notice the aesthetic of early carvings. Some are precise, measured, almost elegant. Others zigzag wildly, as if the carver's hand trembled from cold or excitement. There's an odd intimacy in these variations. Each line is personal, idiosyncratic, a fingerprint in stone or wood. You imagine being a Viking noticing a neighbor's awkward carving, perhaps laughing quietly to yourself, or realizing you're reading the same symbols centuries later. The ancient world feels both distant and immediate, tethered by these marks that refused to remain silent. Even the simplest runes often carried multiple layers. One stick might indicate a trade tally while simultaneously invoking protection from spirits, blending everyday utility with superstition. Fringe scholars love to suggest that some markings formed an early kind of code, a secret language that only initiates could interpret. You picture a small circle of villagers huddled over carvings, whispering to one another as they decipher a message, perhaps about a lost herd or an upcoming feast. Historians still argue whether these overlaps of magic and practicality were intentional or coincidental, but the tension between everyday and mystical is exactly what makes runes mesmerizing. You pause near a mossy rock, tracing a weathered symbol with your fingertip. It's smooth, worn by time, yet stubbornly legible, like someone intentionally left a breadcrumb for you to find. You reflect on how few records survive from this era, how most runes have vanished into soilwood, rot, or fire. And yet the ones that remain whisper stories, the everyday, the magical, the personal, and the unfinished. They insist that you pay attention, that you imagine what was once alive and fleeting. There's a rhythm to all this, the way runes evolve, travel, and persist. Even incomplete marks resonate with meaning. Someone thought, someone carved, someone paused, and that pause itself becomes part of history. You start to feel the first hint of connection to those long-dead hands, the small, deliberate movements, the almost imperceptible decisions. The origin of runes may be obscure, their initial inspiration debated endlessly, yet their presence is undeniable, an echo of human curiosity and intent frozen in time. And as you step back from the riverbank, brushing frost from your sleeves, you notice how the landscape itself seems to respond. The faint wind carries the whisper of symbols, half-formed but insistently there, and you realize that every step forward in this frozen forest is a step into a story that never fully concludes. Even the most practical tally or the most mystical charm leaves an impression unfinished, or not that persists. You breathe in the cold air, feel it in your lungs, and imagine the hands that first shaped these runes, wondering how they too felt the thrill of leaving something behind that might whisper 1,000 years later. You trudge into a small Viking village, the smell of smoked fish and peat smoke mingling in the crisp morning air. The ground crunches beneath your boots, dotted with frost-hardened mud and stray bits of straw. Everywhere you look, the faint scratch of runes catches your eye on doorposts, tool handles, even fragments of pottery left by children. Carving in wood and stone was an everyday part of life, yet also a deeply personal act, a tiny signature in a world where anonymity wasn't exactly valued. You notice how even abandoned or half-finished marks still carry intention, like a thought interrupted mid-sentence. Historians still argue whether some of these carvings were primarily practical or primarily magical, and you're about to see both sides play out in quiet, ordinary spaces. In one corner, a Viking woman carves tally marks and runes into a wooden box. Perhaps she's tracking grains or counting silver coins or leaving a message for her husband returning from the fjord. You can almost hear her murmuring each line under her breath, soft and precise, as if the act of carving alone imbues the symbol with power. A fringe scholar might argue she's actually casting a protective spell on her savings, and while mainstream historians politely roll their eyes, the blend of everyday function and superstition seems undeniable. You trace your fingers over the grooves, feeling the warmth of intention left behind centuries ago. Stone surfaces are equally telling. You come across a low boulder near the village square, its side etched with runes commemorating a fallen warrior, or perhaps simply listing local disputes depending on who you ask. The stone is half-worn lichen creeping over the edges, so you can only make out fragments of lines and curves. One rune seems slightly off, a rogue flourish that might be decorative or accidental, or maybe it was magical, a charm meant to confuse spirits. Historians still argue whether certain anomalies are intentional or merely the result of sloppy carving or weathering. Either way, the stone communicates presence. Someone was here, someone cared, someone left part of themselves behind. You wander to a wooden fence post and notice small runes etched along its edge. These are mundane, counting livestock or marking property boundaries, yet their jagged shapes are oddly elegant. Some include tiny symbols, possibly shorthand for personal names or domestic events. One even appears to include a crude image of a goat. You chuckle at the thought, remembering the distracted rune carvers you've imagined before. Perhaps this was just a note to feed the goat before it eats the basket. Magic and mundane coexist effortlessly here side by side, each carving layered with intention. The tactile sense of these carvings is almost hypnotic. You press your palm lightly against the smooth wood, feeling centuries of handling, sanding, and weathering. Some marks are deep, deliberate, others shallow, like someone changed their mind mid-stroke. Quirky rune fragments suggest moments of whimsy, perhaps a child's first attempt at carving, or a lover's secret note tucked into the corner of a doorframe. Historians still argue whether these whimsical marks were functional, playful, or coded magical signals, but the effect is universally charming. You follow the path to a small workshop where a carpenter is working on a cartwheel. He pauses, occasionally scratching a rune into the wood. Maybe it's a prayer for durability, maybe it's a tally of wheels made this week. You notice subtle variations in each character, the personal touch of hand carving that computers today could never replicate. Fringe scholars suggest the shape of the rune itself could channel energy, perhaps offering protection or luck. You shake your head, smiling at the idea of Viking feng shui, but you can't deny the artistry, the deliberation, the human attention to detail. Even bones were canvases for runes. You come across fragments of animal bones that have been carefully notched and scored, possibly as tallying tools, possibly for ritual purposes. Some include partial inscriptions abandoned mid-mark, as if the carver had been called away suddenly. It's fascinating how the simplest of surfaces, wood, stone, bone, could carry layers of meaning, simultaneously practical and symbolic. You imagine the same bone lying in the dirt centuries ago, waiting for someone like you to notice its quiet persistence. You pause by the river that runs beside the village, noticing a long, thin stick partially submerged in the water. Its runes are nearly eroded, but traces remain. One line indicates a tally, another, a protective symbol, a third, an almost whimsical flourish. The mix of function and magic is typical. A single object could embody multiple intentions, simultaneously mundane and mystical. Historians still argue whether the spatial arrangement of such symbols had ritual significance or was simply dictated by convenience. Either way, the result is mesmerizing, an unfinished lived-in language etched into everyday life. Even in the most ordinary objects, the runes speak. A doorpost, a spoon, a fence corner, each mark whispers history, intention, and personal expression. The juxtaposition of careful carving with casual abandon makes you smile. Someone centuries ago paused mid-thought, left an imperfect mark, and you are here to witness it. In a strange way, you feel connected to the hands that carved, measured, and occasionally doodled a quiet continuum of human presence. By the time you leave the village, you realize that carving in wood and stone was never purely practical. Each mark is a meditation, a tiny pause in time, an interaction between human tool and environment. Even when runes appear unfinished, interrupted, or whimsical, they carry meaning, intention, magic, or memory. The village itself seems to breathe history, the very air humming with echoes of countless hands, scratching, scoring, and whispering across surfaces, leaving a world rich with invisible stories for you to discover. You wander further past the village into a clearing where smoke curls lazily from hearths, carrying the warm, earthy aroma of cooking meat and peat. The air feels alive with small, almost imperceptible hums, as if the runes themselves are vibrating in the quiet. Here, magic and mundanity intertwine, and you begin to notice how Vikings used these jagged lines, not just to record events or inventory, but also to influence the unseen. One rune etched on a doorpost might guard the household against misfortune, while another carved into a drinking horn could ensure a pleasant, mead-induced dream. Historians still argue whether runes were primarily charms or merely practical inscriptions, but you sense that in daily life the distinction was often meaningless. A curious thing about runes is their dual purpose. Some inscriptions commemorate real events, battles, trades, voyages, yet these same symbols often carried mystical weight. You notice a small rough carving on a tool handle. It could be the maker's mark, but fringe scholars speculate it's a protective charm against injury. While working, you lean in, imagining a craftsman murmuring under his breath as he presses the chisel into wood, a little magic embedded into every stroke. The act of carving itself seems to transform the ordinary into something charged, something alive. In another corner, a stick leans against a hut, half-carved runes fading into splintered wood. The lines are jagged, abrupt, as if the carver had been interrupted mid-thought, perhaps by a child asking for a story, or the sudden need to fetch water, or even an inspired insight about the coming harvest. You think about how these unfinished runes mirror life itself, intentions begun, partially realized, lingering quietly. Historians still debate whether incomplete runes had deliberate meaning, like a charm left open, or if they were simply abandoned mundane work. Either way, the uncertainty makes them feel alive, like whispered secrets that demand your attention. You notice runes carved into everyday objects: combs, spoons, walking sticks. Some are practical, perhaps indicating ownership or tallying goods, but others bear strange, seemingly whimsical symbols. A tiny zigzag that looks like lightning, a dot that could be an eye, a curve that seems almost like a smile. Vikings had a playful streak, and sometimes humor crept into inscriptions. One fragment even hints at a mild curse against a mischievous neighbor. You can picture a sibling rolling their eyes, centuries ago mumbling under their breath, "Not again." Runes also appear on amulets, charms, and ritual objects. You find a small bone pendant etched with symbols you can barely make out. This might have been worn around the neck or tucked under a pillow to ward off nightmares, and you wonder whether the carver imagined the future wearer's dreams. The line between mundane and magical is nearly invisible here. Practical and mystical coexist effortlessly, shaping a worldview that balances everyday survival with the unseen forces of fate. Fringe scholars love to propose elaborate magical systems for these marks, though most historians caution against overinterpretation. You walk along the riverbank, spotting runes etched into a flat stone. At first glance, it seems to list inventories, perhaps goods delivered or owed. But a closer look reveals patterns, dots and spirals tucked into corners, additional strokes added in secret that hint at a ritual or incantation. You imagine a traveler kneeling beside the stone, murmuring a soft charm while noting quantities, blending work and magic in a single gesture. Historians still argue whether such dual-purpose inscriptions were widespread, or the exception, and part of you suspects that even the carvers themselves weren't always clear on the line between practicality and enchantment. Even in casual play, runes carried weight. Children might trace symbols in sand or scratch them into sticks, learning language and culture, while inadvertently invoking protective powers or tiny curses. You smile at the thought of Viking kids, half serious, half giggling, experimenting with magical letters the way modern kids might doodle emojis. The intent behind the symbol mattered less than the act of carving itself, and the result was always uniquely human, a mixture of function, superstition, and personal flair. You pause beneath a gnarled tree, noticing the bark bears faint runes from seasons past. Someone carefully etched a message here, maybe a warning, maybe a blessing, but the lines are now almost lost to moss and weather. The incomplete shapes, the tentative strokes, the half-erased meaning, they all whisper continuity. Someone engaged with the world tried to influence it and left a trace for someone like you to discover. Historians still debate whether the mystical function of runes diminished in daily life over time, but the evidence in front of you is vivid. Magic and mundanity walked hand in hand. By the time you leave the clearing, you're struck by how runes were never strictly one thing. Every carved line might be practical, magical, playful, or all three simultaneously. The very act of inscribing a symbol infused it with intent, even if the original purpose was lost centuries ago. The unfinished nature of many carvings only heightens their charm. They are snapshots of thought, mid-flow, private expressions of humans navigating a world both tangible and unseen. You carry that sense with you, the quiet thrill of recognizing the ordinary as extraordinary. You trudge along a winding coastal path, the salt tang of the sea sharp in your nostrils, and catch glimpses of long ships moored just beyond the reeds. Here runes move with people, travelers, traders, raiders, leaving marks in the places they touch. The symbols you've been tracing in village homes now appear on ship prows, trade goods and waypoints carved into stones marking distant shores. The mobility of runes fascinates you. They aren't static, rooted in one place. They are portable, carried across fjords, rivers, and open sea, whispering their meanings to those willing to notice. Historians still argue whether runes spread mainly as practical communication or as vessels of ritualistic and mystical intent, and perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Along the docks, a trader's ledger carved into a wooden plank catches your eye. Quantities of furs, iron, and amber are listed in sharp, precise runes. Some letters accented with tiny marks that might indicate the trader's personal style, or perhaps a protective charm against theft or misfortune. Fringe scholars speculate that these marks could also encode secret information meant only for select buyers, though mainstream historians tend to view them as simple bookkeeping. You imagine a Viking merchant murmuring the totals aloud, each stroke of the knife into wood, a subtle act of both calculation and charm. Ships themselves bear runes along their sides, sometimes painted, sometimes etched into the timbers. These symbols could be ownership marks, the name of the vessel, or invocations of safety for the crew. You lean closer, noticing subtle variations between the same rune repeated along the hull. Was it an artistic flourish, a personal signature, or a tiny charm meant to confuse malevolent spirits at sea? Historians still debate whether the runic inscriptions on ships were primarily practical identifiers or magical safeguards, and the ambiguity makes you smile, imagining Viking sailors consulting a runic checklist before departure. Trade routes offer another layer. You wander inland where merchants exchange goods and ideas and notice carved runes on trade markers and boundary stones. Some simply record quantities or prices, while others seem imbued with ritual significance, their placement perhaps designed to secure prosperity, ward off misfortune, or attract favor from unseen forces. You can almost hear traders joking under their breath, "If the runes favor me, I'll get an extra hide today," or grumbling when a mark seems to fail its purpose. Even in commerce, magic and practicality intertwine seamlessly. You pause by a small market stall, noticing a carved token listing goods delivered from Norway to England. The lines are crisp, each rune slightly different from its neighbors, revealing both the skill of the carver and the personal touch applied to an otherwise mundane ledger. Fringe scholars love to suggest these variations carried hidden codes, perhaps indicating political allegiances or secret messages for rival traders. Historians still argue whether these were intentional or merely stylistic quirks, and for now, you enjoy the ambiguity, letting your imagination wander across centuries. Even raiders carried runes with them. A rough-hewn sword bears a series of inscriptions along its grip, likely the name of the owner or perhaps a prayer for luck in battle. You notice one tiny, nearly imperceptible mark that seems oddly playful for a weapon like a Viking doodle hiding among the solemn symbols. Historians still debate whether runes on arms were largely ceremonial, protective, or merely labels, but you like to think of warriors pausing mid-raid to scrawl a cheeky note for the ages. The duality of function and superstition follows these symbols everywhere. You look at runes left in the wild boundary stones, trade markers, and hidden carvings along forest paths. Travelers etched tally marks, personal signatures, or charms, leaving a trail that others could follow, interpret, or ignore. Even incomplete or faint inscriptions contribute to a complex network of communication and intention, a silent dialogue across landscapes and lifetimes. The unfinished abandoned marks feel especially alive, as if the original carver winked at the future, knowing someone would eventually trace the lines and wonder what they meant. The rhythmic motion of your steps seems to echo the rhythm of runes in transit, moving from hand to hand, ship to ship, village to village. You imagine someone in a distant fjord finding an unfamiliar rune on a piece of traded timber and pausing, puzzled, curious, intrigued, already part of the conversation that spans centuries. Magic, utility play, and record-keeping all travel together, a mobile heritage as tangible as the salt on your skin and as elusive as a whispered legend. As you pause atop a cliff overlooking the bay, the long ships glint in the sun and you notice subtle runic marks on masts, planks, and cargo crates. The movement of runes mirrors the movement of the Vikings themselves, sometimes practical, sometimes mystical, occasionally playful, always leaving traces. Even if the meaning has faded or shifted, the very act of inscription preserves intention, connection, and curiosity, whispering to anyone who notices. And you, of course, are noticing, listening, imagining, and becoming part of that long chain of observation and interpretation. By the time you step away from the harbor, you realize runes were never static. Their meanings traveled as much as the people who carved them, bending, adapting, and persisting in both practical and magical ways. You feel the energy of those who carried them, their hands tracing letters across woodbone and stone, leaving echoes of life in motion. You inhale deeply, tasting the salt, and understand that runes weren't just symbols. They were companions on journeys, quiet reminders that even ordinary objects could hold extraordinary intention. You trudge through a dense forest, sunlight dappled across frost-speckled moss, and imagine entering a Viking temple, the air heavy with incense smoke and the faint tang of pine resin. Here, runes take on a different resonance. They appear on altar stones, ceremonial weapons, and grave goods, hinting at sacred intent and ritual significance. Perhaps a rune carved into a drinking horn blesses the next feast, or one etched into a grave marker guides a soul through the afterlife. Historians still debate whether the primary function of runes in such contexts was religious or symbolic, but you feel the quiet gravity of these markings as if they vibrate with unseen power. You pause by a wooden idol, noticing runes scratched along its base. Some are clear, linear utilitarian inscriptions, noting offerings or ownership, while others are curvy, chaotic, or incomplete, almost like improvisation. Fringe scholars suggest these marks could channel spiritual energy, functioning as both prayers and protective spells. You imagine a priest or perhaps a child helping a parent, running a knife along the surface, murmuring softly, blending devotion with daily life. The carved lines are tactile like whispers, frozen in wood, inviting you to trace them with your eyes and mind. The forest hums as you wander past burial mounds, some modest, some monumental. Rune-inscribed stones poke through grass and lichen, their messages partially eroded, yet still legible to those who care to interpret. You envision families placing goods beside the deceased comb knife, small wooden figures each marked with runes intended to guide or protect. Historians still argue whether these inscriptions were meant to communicate with the living, the dead, or the gods themselves, and you're content to let the ambiguity linger, enjoying the subtle tension between the practical and the mystical. Even everyday objects carried sacred weight here. A bone needle etched with a single rune might have belonged to a seamstress or warrior's spouse, a personal charm, blended seamlessly with work. Perhaps it brought speed, accuracy, or protection while sewing, or maybe it simply marked the owner's handwork. Fringe theorists like to suggest that the alignment and style of each rune could affect its magical potency, though the evidence is often circumstantial. You trace the line gently with your finger, feeling centuries of careful repetition and intention. You wander toward a low stone altar, rough-hewn yet precise, where offerings have been left. Runic inscriptions here might record prayers, blessings, or invocations for good fortune. Some symbols are elaborate with embellishments that suggest ritual sophistication, while others are simple, hurried, or incomplete. You notice a faint, almost playful zigzag along one edge. Was it a later addition? a mistake or a secret charm meant to confuse spirits. Historians still debate whether such irregularities were intentional, and you enjoy imagining both possibilities. The forest path narrows and you pass a small moss-covered shrine tucked into the roots of an ancient tree. Inside, shards of pottery and fragments of wood bear runes, each carved with purpose. You envision offerings being left here for months or years, runes slowly weathering while people pass by, their lives intersecting with this quiet, sacred space. Some marks appear unfinished, the knife lifted mid-stroke, hinting at interruption, human hesitation, or perhaps intentional open-ended magic. The forest seems to hold its breath around these symbols, waiting for someone like you to notice. You think about ritual beyond the temple. Runic inscriptions also appear on swords, shields, and personal items, often intended to protect the owner or bless an endeavor. A warrior might scrawl a line into his weapon before battle, mumbling a charm, blending practicality with superstition seamlessly. Fringe scholars propose complex magical formulas encoded in the layout and style of runes, though mainstream historians caution against overreading. Regardless, the presence of runes transforms objects from mere tools into carriers of human intention. Even the most humble rune-inscribed items whisper of belief. A drinking horn, a comb, or a spear might bear a simple symbol, unadorned yet meaningful. You can almost hear the quiet chanting of a maker or owner, their breath warm on wood, their hands steady as they carve a connection between themselves and the divine, or simply a hope for good luck. Historians still argue about the extent to which runes were religious versus social or decorative, and the ambiguity makes each artifact feel alive, a mystery waiting to be interpreted. As you leave the sacred grove, the sunlight softens, filtering through frost-dusted branches. You realize runes occupy a liminal space between the tangible and intangible records of the living gestures toward the unseen whispers of belief and habit. The unfinished, playful, deliberate marks all speak to a worldview where everyday life and ritual intertwine seamlessly, where magic doesn't require spectacle, but thrives in ordinary acts of carving and observation. By the time you step back onto the wider trail, you carry the sense that runes were more than writing. They were bridges between worlds. They guided, protected, recorded, and played blurring lines between practical and sacred, and leaving traces that remain legible or at least intelligible to anyone who chooses to listen. You inhale deeply, letting the forest and its quiet magic settle in your chest, feeling the persistent echo of intention left behind by countless hands. You trudge onward, the path narrowing beneath low-hanging branches that scratch lightly against your shoulders, and imagine settling beside a flickering fire in a Viking hall. Smoke curls upward, carrying scents of roasted meat, tallow lamps, and the faint tang of damp wool. Around you, skalds, poets, and storytellers chant tales of gods, heroes, and distant lands, their voices rising and falling with a rhythm older than most kingdoms. And woven into their performance are runes, etched into prop sticks and even the wooden shields leaning against walls. These symbols aren't just decoration, they interact with the oral performance, reinforcing memory, marking rhythm, or even embedding subtle ritual intent. Historians still argue whether runes significantly shaped oral traditions or were merely decorative mnemonic devices, and the debate feels perfectly suited to a quiet evening like this. You notice a skald picking up a carved stick, mid-story, the runes on it accentuating the tale's flow. Perhaps a line marks the beginning of a stanza, or a symbol reminds the performer of a rhyme or meter. Fringe scholars suggest these marks could have been magical, designed to make the stories more compelling or protective, ensuring the tale survives intact. You lean closer, imagining the tiny scratches catching the lamplight, each one a silent cue in a centuries-old dialogue between storyteller, audience, and memory itself. Runes also appear on items used in storytelling. A shield might bear a sequence commemorating a victory, a horn to recall a trick or a humorous anecdote, even small wooden figures inscribed with symbols to personify gods or legendary figures. You imagine a skald laughing softly as they pick up a figure tracing the rune, whispering, "Remember how Loki fooled everyone?" The line between practical mnemonic and ritual charm blurs, and even ordinary objects feel charged with narrative life. Historians still argue whether these items were essential memory aids or merely ornamental, and the uncertainty leaves you delightfully adrift in imagination. In quieter corners you find small love notes or playful insults carved into wooden benches, firewood or door frames. One fragment reads like a personal message. "If you steal my fish again, Odin will know." The humor and intimacy are striking. Vikings weren't all war and conquest, they left traces of everyday life humor and private sentiment hidden in plain sight. Fringe researchers love to speculate about secret messages or coded communication embedded in such inscriptions, though mainstream historians tend to caution against overreading. Either way, the dual-purpose, playful, practical, and occasionally magical makes you smile, imagining centuries-old giggles echoing softly through the hall. The carvings also act as anchors for stories. One carved stick might reference a specific hero's deed, reminding the audience of a stanza or a punchline. Another rune sequence could note the order of chanted verses or the moral lesson to be emphasized. Even partial or unfinished runes carry meaning. A line left incomplete mid-story might signal improvisation, a pause for effect, or simply an interrupted thought. Historians still debate whether the incomplete inscriptions were intentional dramatic devices or the product of distraction, but the ambiguity adds a lively human texture. You notice subtle patterns in the runes themselves. Certain strokes repeat, forming visual motifs that complement the narrative. Zigzags echo, battlefields, dots mark, pauses and curves suggest motion or emotion. You can almost see the skald's hands moving in tandem with their speech, tracing these marks to guide both their storytelling and the audience's comprehension. The physicality of writing interacting with oral tradition seems intuitive yet sophisticated, and the incomplete, whimsical or eccentric forms make you think about the human desire to leave a personal imprint even in fleeting performances. Children too participate. You imagine little apprentices tracing runes in sand or on scraps of wood, learning both letters and lore. Perhaps they imitate a skald's gestures, whispering symbols aloud, their voices mingling with the older storytellers. Even minor mistakes or playful alterations in the runes contribute to the living tradition, revealing that storytelling and writing were not static, but dynamic, evolving with each generation. Fringe scholars suggest that children's adaptations could hold subtle ritual power, though mainstream historians generally see it as informal learning. You lean back, picturing tiny hands, sketching lines in the dust, fully absorbed, contributing to history in miniature. You pause, absorbing the interplay of story symbol and personal expression. The hall feels alive, a microcosm of Viking life, where magic, memory, and everyday activity coalesce seamlessly. Even the simplest inscriptions, unfinished, playful or practical, enrich the performance, embedding personal, mystical and cultural layers into what might otherwise seem like mere entertainment. Historians still debate how deeply runes shaped oral tradition, but the resonance is undeniable. The marks serve as both guide and echo, helping stories survive centuries. As the fire crackles and the hall grows quiet, you sense the persistence of these symbols. They are witnesses, guides, and companions, capturing both the epic and the mundane. You exhale slowly, letting the warmth of imagined hearth and flickering flame settle into your chest, realizing that runes in storytelling are more than marks. They are bridges across time, connecting teller, listener, and silent observer. You shuffle onward into a dim Viking town at dusk, the air cool with sea spray drifting in from the harbor. The clatter of tools, quiet torches begin to glow, and you spot something ordinary, yet quietly intimate: scraps of wood, bone, and stone, scratched with runes that carry not solemn prayers or grand sagas, but cheeky messages, personal notes, even love letters. You lean closer, half expecting to hear the faint giggle of the carver still lingering in the grooves. One message etched onto a piece of bone bluntly reads something like, "Kiss me, don't tell." Another, carved into a plank from a workshop, blurts out an insult, "You're as useless as a blunt axe." Historians still argue whether such inscriptions were tossed off graffiti teaching exercises or sincere communication, but the very existence of them paints a picture of Vikings as people with humor, pettiness, and longing, not just warriors with axes. Fringe scholars have even suggested some inscriptions carried hidden codes like riddles or private jokes, intelligible only to a small circle, though mainstream voices usually roll their eyes and call it wishful thinking. You wander down a narrow lane, torchlight flickering against timber walls, and notice runes scratched into doorframes. Some are little more than initials, ownership marks, or the equivalent of a doodled signature. Others are suggestive symbols that might ward off thieves, or maybe just a way of saying Bjorn lives here, don't mess with his goats. The scratches are crooked, uneven, sometimes unfinished, like someone was interrupted mid-sentence. You imagine a harried Viking housewife, knife in hand, half carving, half scolding a child at the same time. The result feels personal, imperfect, and deeply human. A different set of inscriptions belongs to lovers. Small wooden sticks bear messages of devotion, hearts, before there were hearts lines promising fidelity, or simply names paired together, scratched hastily before being pocketed or hidden. You picture a young man nervously carving a rune for his crush, the letters slightly crooked because his hands shook, then tucking it under her seat at the longhouse. Historians still debate whether these runes should be considered part of formal literacy or just casual scrawls, but that tension is exactly what makes them feel alive. Humor pops up everywhere. One rune stick found in Bergen reads like an ancient equivalent of "you smell." Another pokes fun at a neighbor's hairline. You chuckle, realizing Vikings weren't shy about roasting each other, carving their sarcasm into eternity. Fringe enthusiasts like to argue that even jokes had protective magic, that by mocking someone you could ward off envy or bad spirits, but mainstream scholars usually prefer to see it as, well, just very old comedy. Still, the thought of a magical knock-knock joke has its charm. Even marketplaces carried these playful marks. You picture a merchant carving a quick rune into a crate of herring, not only to mark his goods, but also to slip in a little joke, maybe something like, "This fish stinks less than you do." Buyers might grin when they noticed, carrying away both the fish and the jest. Inscriptions like these blur the line between commerce literacy and humor, proof that rune carving wasn't always solemn business, but could be part of everyday banter. Some inscriptions veered into insults sharp enough to sting even centuries later. A scratched plank from a shipyard bluntly accused someone of laziness, while another graffiti-like mark in a public space essentially called someone a thief. You grin, realizing ancient Vikings had their own version of internet comment sections, only instead of anonymous usernames, their complaints were immortalized in wood and stone. Historians still argue whether these inscriptions were spontaneous graffiti or deliberately placed as warnings, but either way they reveal voices unsanitized by time. The quirkiest bits are unfinished. A rune series trailing off midline suggests the carver lost interest, was interrupted, or maybe dropped the stick in a puddle. You imagine a half-finished love confession, interrupted by someone walking in, the poor rune-smitten Viking pocketing the stick before being teased. These incomplete whispers feel the most human of all tangible traces of hesitations and half-spoken thoughts. The beauty of these messages lies in their ordinariness. They weren't intended for kings, gods, or epic memory. They were intended for neighbors, lovers, and friends. They show Vikings had sarcasm, tenderness, and pettiness all scratched into daily life. You smile at the realization, even 1,000 years later, people's hearts and humor don't change much. The runes whisper not just of grandeur, but of stolen kisses, snide comments, and giggles carved into eternity. You leave the town's edge as the torches fade behind you. The night air grows colder, but your mind is warmed by these glimpses of everyday humanity. The runes no longer seem distant, solemn relics. They feel like text messages across centuries, sometimes sweet, sometimes rude, always deeply alive. You step into an open field, the night sky vast above you, stars pricking the dark like tiny runes of their own. The air is sharp with the smell of cold earth, and in the distance faint bells chime from livestock being led into pens. Here, away from the bustle of town, you find another side of runes, quiet, methodical, and tied to the rhythm of time itself. Runes you learn weren't just for love notes or insults. They also carved order into the cycles of sun, moon, and seasons. The Vikings had what are sometimes called runic calendars, ingenious sticks or staffs carved with symbols to track days, weeks, and the passage of festivals. Imagine a long piece of wood, its surface scored with neat notches, each mark representing a day, while certain runes signal special feasts or saints' days after Christian influence creeps in. You picture a farmer running his finger along the carved surface, checking when it's time to plant barley or when the longest night of winter would demand a ritual fire. Historians still argue whether these calendars were widely used tools or rare curiosities owned only by elites, but their existence suggests an impressive precision for a society so often painted as purely chaotic raiders. The most famous form, the primstav, would come later in Norway, wooden staffs that encoded an entire year into tiny symbols. Earlier versions may have relied heavily on rune-like marks that mapped out lunar cycles. Fringe scholars even suggest Vikings encoded magical protection into these calendar runes, ensuring not just accurate timekeeping, but also blessings for the seasons. You grin at the thought of someone carefully carving half-practical, half-ritual whispering, "Don't let the frost ruin the harvest." You crouch down, tracing shapes in the dirt, imagining how the younger Futhark rune set lent itself to counting and marking. Certain runes had numerical associations, making them useful for recording quantities or intervals of time. A staff marked with alternating runes could act like a medieval planner, blending mnemonic and symbolic logic. Historians still argue whether this was a standardized practice or improvised locally, and the fact that no two surviving examples match exactly suggests the latter. But isn't that more charming? Each staff a personal take on the calendar, like a handmade wall planner, but with much more style. Seasonal cycles mattered deeply. You imagine winter nights marked with notches for Yule, when fires burned bright and mead flowed freely. Summer festivals had their own runic signs tied to planting or sailing. Perhaps a sailor traced a carved mark before leaving port, checking which phase of the moon favored safe passage. A farmer, meanwhile, might study the same staff to decide whether lambing season would align with a festival feast. Practical need and spiritual rhythm were inseparable here. Keeping time meant keeping harmony. Of course, mistakes happen. Archaeologists have found carved staves where a mark seems misplaced, corrected awkwardly, or simply left dangling. Maybe a distracted carver miscounted, or maybe they were half a mug of mead deep when chiseling. Fringe enthusiasts argue these errors are actually deliberate symbolic choices encoding secret knowledge or ritual gaps. Mainstream historians tend to sigh and call them human error. You lean toward imagining both someone carving earnestly, realizing too late they'd skipped a day, then muttering, "Well, maybe Thor won't notice." Runic calendars also bridged pagan and Christian practices. As Christianity spread, rune marks adapted to track saints' feast days alongside older seasonal rituals. This blending shows resilience, not abandonment. Vikings folding new rhythms into old tools. You imagine a staff carrying both the rune for Yule and a mark for St. Olaf's Day, side by side, bridging centuries of belief. Historians still argue whether such duality was pragmatic or resistant, but you sense it was both a society negotiating time itself with the tip of a knife. And then there's the open question of symbolism. Some marks are so stylized they're nearly impossible to interpret, curling away from strict rune forms into decorative or abstract shapes. Were these simply artistic flourishes, or did they hide meanings now lost? You tilt your head, thinking of unfinished runes from earlier sections, maybe calendars too. Whispered meanings incomplete, deliberately left to the imagination or the gods. You stand in the quiet field, feeling the rhythm of night and season pressing softly around you. The stars above seem like a celestial primstav, each lighter marker in some vast calendar no Viking could carve, but many surely pondered. In that moment, you feel the runes not as relics of superstition, but as tools of orientation, anchoring lives in cycles of dark and light, feast and famine, work and rest. As you walk on, you realize these rune-carved calendars still whisper across time, reminding you that even amid raiding and wandering, the Vikings were deeply attuned to patience, precision, and cosmic rhythm. The scratches in wood and bone weren't just records, they were steady breaths of order in a chaotic world, lines that taught humans when to sow, when to reap, and when to pause for a feast under the stars. You wander into a wind-swept meadow where massive stones rise from the earth, their surfaces etched with runes that still catch the sun despite centuries of rain and frost. These rune stones stand like frozen storytellers, each one tall enough to demand notice, each one carved with a message meant to outlast generations. You step closer, running your eyes along the long, straight lines of runes that march down the granite, some crisp and legible, others worn to soft shadows. These are not playful notes or calendar marks, these are monuments, commemorations, and mysteries. One stone proclaims boldly, "Thorstein raised this stone for his brother who died abroad." Simple, direct, but poignant. Another records a victory in battle, its lines accompanied by carved beasts twining around the edges. You imagine families gathering as the stone was raised, the sound of chisels echoing against granite, voices chanting prayers or boasting songs. Historians still argue whether the act of raising rune stones was primarily commemorative, political, or religious, and perhaps the truth is all three: personal grief, public declaration, and spiritual offering bound together in one massive slab. Not every stone is clear. Some bear messages so fragmented or ambiguous that interpreters disagree even today. A sequence of runes may trail off unfinished or twist into decorative flourishes that could mean nothing or everything. Fringe scholars propose that some stones intentionally hid meanings reserved only for those initiated into secret knowledge. Mainstream historians prefer to see them as stylistic or incomplete, the work of carvers experimenting or running out of space. Either way, the ambiguity leaves you lingering, staring at curves and angles that seem to hum with unfinished intent. Certain stones stand in clusters, forming landscapes of memory. You picture a field dotted with tall granite slabs, each one narrating a death, a voyage, or a claim of land. The wind whistles between them like voices weaving stories together. Some stones are richly decorated with interlacing patterns and serpentine creatures, others are stark and plain. You crouch by one modest stone and imagine the family who raised it, perhaps less wealthy, carving only what they could afford, yet still determined to etch their loved one's presence into permanence. The most famous rune stones, like the Jelling stones in Denmark, blend art and proclamation. One side depicts Christ, the other coils with dragons, while the runes proudly declare a king's lineage. You picture the political theatre of such a monument, an entire kingdom story carved in stone, half sermon, half brag. Historians still argue whether the Christian imagery replaced or simply joined older traditions, but the duality shows a society in transition, unwilling to discard runes even as Latin letters gained ground. You run your hand along an imaginary inscription. Gunnar raised this stone for his wife. These quiet personal declarations bring you closer to the carvers. Love, grief, pride, they all survive in scratches on rock. Fringe researchers like to imagine that certain stones carried protective enchantments for the land they marked, creating magical borders as well as memorials. Maybe a stone at a property's edge warned both human and spirit intruders, its words half visible, but its presence commanding. And then there are the stubborn puzzle stones so strange they defy translation. One may carry runes in unusual order, another stacked in patterns, another wrapping in spirals across the surface. Were they playful riddles, coded messages, or deliberate art? Historians still argue whether such inscriptions were experiments, errors, or intended mysteries, and you're left with the sense that some stones whisper on purpose, resisting final interpretation. The act of raising a rune stone was communal. Imagine dozens of people hauling the heavy rock upright ropes, creaking voices shouting in rhythm. When it finally stood, there was feasting, chanting, perhaps even a sprinkling of ale or blood at its base. The runes, newly carved, gleamed sharply in sunlight, shouting into history. You exhale, realizing that these monuments were as much about the living community as about the dead or absent. As twilight spreads across the meadow, the rune stones seem to glow faintly, catching the last gold light. They are both practical inscriptions and enduring symbols, unfinished in meaning because we will never know every story behind them. They whisper half-tales across centuries, daring you to lean closer to fill the gaps with imagination. You step away reluctantly, the silhouettes of stones lingering behind you like guardians. These monuments remain not just as records, but as echoes of intention, voices carved into granite that still call out, half legible, half mysterious, refusing to fall silent. The path carries you onward into a quiet glade where broken stones lie half buried, their surfaces fractured and faint. Here you encounter the ghostly side of runes, the rare, the strange, and the almost forgotten symbols that never quite made it into the main alphabet. You crouch down beside a cracked piece of slate, tracing lines that don't look like the familiar Futhark set. They are crooked, experimental, or unfinished, like a carver testing possibilities. Historians still argue whether these oddities represent local dialects, personal inventions, or transitional phases of runic writing, but the mystery remains tantalizing. Some inscriptions feature runes known only from a handful of finds. They hover on the edge of the system like guests who showed up at the feast but never got invited back. A rune that looks like a cross between a fishhook and a zigzag, another shaped almost like a sideways ladder, both identified, debated and catalogued, but still not fully understood. Fringe scholars argue that these were magical symbols, deliberately obscured to prevent misuse. Mainstream voices suggest they were simply awkward attempts at adapting runes to sounds the standard set didn't cover. Either way, they flicker like whispers from forgotten dialects. You imagine a young carver experimenting, knife in hand, inventing a new mark to capture a sound, carving it proudly into wood, only for it never to catch on. Maybe their friends laughed, maybe no one understood, and so the rune drifted into obscurity. Yet the scratches remain, defying erasure. You smile at the thought even failed ideas leave scars worth reading. Sometimes whole sequences of runes resist categorization. They look familiar at first, but the order is wrong or the strokes are reversed, like a mirror image. Were these errors or deliberate experiments? Historians still debate whether they represent mislearned alphabets, coded messages, or perhaps ritual play. Imagine carving backwards for magical emphasis or leaving a sequence half complete so spirits could finish it. The ambiguity makes even broken fragments feel alive with possibility. The quirks appear not just in stones, but in objects of daily life. A bone comb bears a rune that doesn't appear anywhere else in the archaeological record. A wooden plank has symbols scratched over and over, as if someone were practicing or obsessing over one peculiar shape. Were they doodles, drills, or deliberate creations? Fringe theories claim such repeated markings acted like charms, building strength through repetition, like a Viking version of writing affirmations. Mainstream historians usually settle on someone was bored, but you can't help imagining the hum of intent behind every repetition. Occasionally, you find hybrid inscriptions, half rune, half something else. One stone seems to borrow forms from Latin letters, bending them into rune-like strokes. Another inscription fuses curves and dots in patterns that feel decorative, but might conceal words. Historians still argue whether such hybrids were transitional scribbles during Christianization, or playful artistry, or attempts at secret writing. You tilt your head, recognizing in them the timeless human urge to experiment with form, to leave something personal, even in the midst of standardization. Some lost runes may never be recovered. The material's wood-bone wax decayed long ago, leaving only tantalizing hints. You picture an entire shadow alphabet whispered in firelight, carved briefly into wood, then burned as fuel never intended for eternity. The thought makes you pause, realizing how much knowledge slipped away, not because it was erased, but because it was temporary by design. The runes you see today are only a fraction of what once lived. Even among the official runes, variation abounds. A single rune might be drawn with different strokes depending on region, century, or even mood. Some inscriptions play with proportions, stretching or compressing runes into stylized forms. Historians still argue whether this was practical adaptation or personal flair, but the effect is clear: runes were not frozen. They breathed, flexed, and shifted. You imagine the individuality of each carver shining through their quirks, preserved in stone. The broken stones beneath you feel less like relics and more like unfinished conversations. They hold potential rather than closure, hints of a broader system that was never neatly codified. The forgotten symbols whisper not of failure, but of experimentation, of creativity, always reaching beyond the bounds of what survived. As you rise and move on, you glance back at the fractured runes glimmering faintly in moss and twilight. They remind you that language itself is never complete. It is always shifting, always losing and gaining, always whispering meanings, half finished. The Vikings left behind not only clarity but mystery, and the mystery might be the most human legacy of all. You wander along a rugged coastline, the waves slapping rhythmically against black rocks, gulls shrieking overhead. Here, far from the Scandinavian heartlands, you stumble upon runes carved into stone, outcrops, ship timbers, and even church walls. These inscriptions whisper of journeys, Viking traders, raiders, settlers who carried their alphabet into foreign lands and adapted it to new tongues, new needs, and new audiences. The marks feel both familiar and strange, like hearing your native language spoken with a new accent. In the British Isles, for instance, you find runes scratched into memorial stones and small everyday objects. Some are clearly Norse, but others mingle with local symbols, hinting at cultural blending. Historians still argue whether these hybrid inscriptions reflect bilingual communities or simply curious experimentation by carvers eager to try out new scripts. Imagine a Viking trader in York carving his name with runes on a warehouse beam, then adding a local flourish for flair. Fringe scholars even suggest that such hybrids served as secret codes. Only those fluent in both traditions could read them smoothly. In Iceland, where sagas later flourished, runes seem to stretch their role even further. You picture settlers marking boundary stones with carved symbols, mixing practicality with hints of magic, as if the letters themselves could claim land. Some inscriptions are strangely elaborate, almost talismanic. A wooden spindle whorl inscribed with runes might have belonged to a woman weaving spells as well as cloth. Historians still debate whether these Icelandic artifacts were practical tools, charms, or both. You smile, imagining someone muttering, "If the sweater doesn't keep you warm, maybe the rune will." Travel farther east and you find runes scattered along rivers leading deep into Russia, where Vikings, known there as Varangians, traded furs, silver, and slaves. In Novgorod, inscriptions etched into birch bark show signs of Norse influence, though they're written in Old Russian. Could runes have mingled with Cyrillic in the minds of merchants? Fringe theories say yes, envisioning lost alphabets merging into hybrid forms. Mainstream historians urge caution, pointing out that most finds are Cyrillic, but they admit the possibility of cross-pollination. You picture a trader carving a rune onto his boat while speaking a Slavic tongue, unconsciously bridging cultures. Even in Constantinople, far from the fjords, runes appear. Scratched into the walls of Hagia Sophia are faint marks, names, and phrases in Norse runes, likely left by Varangian guard mercenaries. You lean closer in imagination, tracing one that reads something like "Halfdan was here." It's basically ancient graffiti, bold in its ordinariness yet startling in its location. Historians still argue whether these inscriptions were acts of casual pride or intentional markers of identity in a foreign land. Either way, they anchor the Vikings firmly into the fabric of the wider world. Some runes abroad take on new lives entirely. In Greenland, inscriptions linger at abandoned farmsteads, recording names and dates, like tiny whispers in the wilderness. On one slab of stone, a line notes the death of a man in the year 1400, centuries after runes had declined elsewhere. The persistence feels stubborn, as if isolated communities clung to runes like lifelines. Historians still debate whether this was conservatism or necessity, but either way the marks stand as proof of cultural endurance in icy silence. Runes even appear where you least expect them, scratched lightly into coins, engraved onto jewelry, woven into architecture. Sometimes they were functional marking ownership or blessing. Sometimes they were playful small jokes slipped into decorative borders, and sometimes they defy easy explanation. Fringe scholars leap on these anomalies, claiming secret societies or mystical codes, while mainstream voices roll their eyes and mutter about doodles. You meanwhile simply enjoy the thought that even abroad runes kept their flexible human quality useful, one moment whimsical the next. Walking along the coast, you feel the runes' adaptability in your bones. They were never confined to one soil. They wandered as far as their carvers traveled, taking on new shapes and purposes. They could mark a grave in Iceland, a prayer in Britain, a joke in Constantinople, a claim in Greenland. Historians still argue whether their spread represented cultural dominance or cultural compromise, but you sense both. The runes whispered, and foreign lands whispered back. As you pause on a rock, the waves crash louder and you picture each inscription scattered across continents like driftwood washed ashore. Some were serious, some playful, some unfinished, but all of them marked presence. They say I was here. We were here. Even far from Scandinavia, the runes refused to be silenced, carving traces of human voices into every corner the Vikings touched. The path you follow grows quieter now, the crunch of gravel beneath your feet softer, as though the world itself is winding down. You start to notice gaps where runes should be, places where wooden beams once bore carvings, now long decayed, or stones where faint grooves have faded under centuries of weather. It feels like standing at the edge of a language's life, the moment when words begin slipping from memory into silence. By the later Middle Ages, runes were already yielding ground to Latin letters. The spread of Christianity brought not only new beliefs, but also the monks' writing systems. Latin had prestige. It was the language of the Church of Law of international communication. Runes, by contrast, seemed provincial, bound to pagan roots, better suited to carving into sticks than composing elaborate manuscripts. Historians still argue whether runes fell because they were impractical or because they were deliberately suppressed, a kind of cultural rebranding. Yet their decline wasn't sudden. In some pockets of Scandinavia, runes lingered stubborn and adaptable. Farmers used them for everyday notations, carving tally marks into wood or labeling tools with simple runic letters. A few rune calendars, known as primstaves, kept time with carved notches, blending Christian feast days with older seasonal cycles. You picture a farmer consulting his staff in the dim morning light, squinting to see whether today meant planting or praying. It's half almanac, half spiritual guide, useful in a way Latin letters alone could not quite match. One quirky survival comes from Sweden, where rural communities continued carving runes well into the 19th century. Known as dalrunes, these late descendants look like distant cousins of the elder forms, stripped down almost shorthand. It's as if runes refused to die quietly, instead sneaking into the margins of history, lingering on in barns and parish records. Fringe scholars sometimes claim these were deliberate acts of cultural resistance, while mainstream historians suggest they were simply practical habits. Either way, it's striking to imagine peasants still scratching runes, while cities nearby filled with books printed in Latin script. The debate over runic decline is full of what-ifs. Some argue that if runes had been adapted to parchment earlier, they might have competed with Latin alphabets more effectively. Others suggest that their deep connection to carving woodbone stone was both their strength and their downfall. Runes looked sturdy, but once parchment and ink became dominant, they felt out of place. You joke to yourself it's like runes missed the memo that the future belonged to paperwork. Still, the transition was not uniform. Icelandic manuscripts sometimes sprinkled in runes, treating them as symbols of magic or emphasis. Even in Christian contexts, a rune or two might slip in, almost like a visual charm hidden among solemn Latin lines. Historians still argue whether this was superstition or style, but it suggests runes never truly vanished. They just became quieter, more ornamental, more secretive. The archaeological record supports this sense of fading but persistent whispers. Stones from the 11th and 12th centuries increasingly show Latin crosses alongside runic inscriptions, a merging of traditions. Some rune stones even carry inscriptions in both alphabets side by side, as though acknowledging a handover. You imagine a carver pausing chisel in hand and thinking, do I carve this in the old way or the new way, maybe both just to be safe? And yet there's an unfinished quality to their decline. The last known runic inscriptions don't end with a dramatic final flourish, they simply taper off casual and mundane. A farmer's mark here, a date there, a gravestone in the 15th century, a barn carving in the 17th. The letters shrink into practical invisibility like footsteps fading into the snow. Historians still argue whether this slow fading reflects cultural assimilation or a deeper reluctance to abandon a script that had always been part of daily life. You look around in your imagination at fields now farmed with iron ploughs, at churches ringing bells instead of invoking charms. Runes haven't disappeared, not entirely. They've just shifted roles from public proclamations to private notes, from sacred inscriptions to quiet habits. The world no longer centers on them, but they linger like a whisper under the surface. As you stand at this threshold of change, you feel the melancholy of languages slipping away. But there's also resilience. Runes didn't vanish in one stroke. They faded, adapted, and sometimes reappeared in unexpected corners long after Latin letters had won the spotlight. Their decline wasn't a death, it was a transformation, leaving traces for the curious, reminders for the stubborn, and mysteries for historians who still argue over their true end. The trail you've been walking grows busier again, as if centuries are rushing to catch up with you. By the 19th century, runes, those old fading scratches, suddenly became fashionable once more. Scholars, romantics, and mystics all leaned in, eager to hear whispers from the Viking past. It feels almost ironic. Runes had dwindled in barns and backyards, only to be resurrected in universities' parlors and even secret societies. In Scandinavia, antiquarians began cataloguing rune stones with meticulous zeal. Imagine dusty professors sketching inscriptions, measuring strokes with rulers, and debating translations over candlelight. For them, runes weren't just relics, they were proof of national heritage threads tying modern nations back to legendary ancestors. The rise of nationalism in the 19th century turned rune stones into patriotic monuments. Every carved stone in a farmer's field became a national treasure. Historians still argue whether this rediscovery was about genuine curiosity or political identity building. At the same time, fringe voices spun runes into something far more mystical. Romantic poets and occultists treated them as magical codes, repositories of ancient wisdom. You picture a Victorian gentleman with too much hair wax, holding up a rune-inscribed amulet and whispering, "The power is real, old chap." To some, runes were the Viking equivalent of tarot cards. Mainstream historians raised eyebrows, pointing out that most Viking inscriptions said things like Thorstein carved this, rather than cosmic truths. Still, the mystical aura stuck. One quirky revival came from Germany, where the fascination with runes fed into esoteric movements in the early 20th century. Some nationalists reimagined them as symbols of racial destiny, twisting scholarship into ideology. Historians still debate the exact line between scholarly study and political misuse, but the uncomfortable legacy remains. You almost want to shake those old rune enthusiasts and say, guys, Halfdan's graffiti in Constantinople was not a world-dominating prophecy. Meanwhile, in Britain and beyond, runes seeped into literature and art. Authors like Tolkien studied them closely, weaving them into fantasy worlds. Suddenly, the alphabet of the Vikings appeared in children's books, adventure novels, even puzzles. The runes became part academic curiosity, part pop culture Easter egg. You grin, imagining a child tracing a rune in a Tolkien map and unknowingly touching a symbol that once marked Viking gravestones. By the late 20th century, runes had taken on yet another life. Neo-pagan groups embraced them as tools of divination, laying them out like cards to predict the future. Historians still argue whether this represents a genuine continuation of old magical uses or an entirely modern invention. Either way, the runes sets sold in little velvet pouches at occult shops tell their own story. People still want the runes to whisper something personal, unfinished, and mysterious. Quirky tidbits abound in this revival. In some Scandinavian villages, farmers who once ignored rune stones suddenly found tourists lining up to photograph them. Old inscriptions that had sat for centuries half buried in moss became selfie backdrops. Fringe scholars claimed new discoveries every few months, sometimes reading entire sagas into faint scratches that were probably plough marks. Mainstream experts shook their heads, but the enthusiasm was undeniable. And then there's the academic side, philologists painstakingly mapping out runic evolution, building dictionaries, publishing volumes of inscriptions. To them, runes were not mystical codes or nationalist emblems, but historical sources. They treated every crooked stroke as a data point, a chance to reconstruct language and culture. Historians still debate how much interpretation can be trusted, but the fact remains runes had moved from fading scratches to front-row subjects in university halls. You sense walking through this whirlwind of rediscovery that runes never really died. They just waited. They lingered long enough for people to find new uses, new meanings, new projections. Sometimes it was patriotism, sometimes it was mysticism, sometimes it was scholarship or art. Each revival added a new layer, like fresh carvings over ancient grooves. The runes themselves haven't changed, they're still the same strokes and lines, but their whispers now echo through different ears, speaking to desires far removed from Viking fields and firesides. They've been patriotic symbols, occult tokens, fantasy alphabet, archaeological treasure. And each role leaves the question dangling: were the runes ever finished, or are they always being rewritten? The path is nearly still now, as if all the centuries you've walked through have gently folded themselves into silence. You pause and the runes seem to gather around you, etched in stone, scrawled on wood, whispered into air. They are no longer only Viking markers, they are fragments of meaning that have drifted into every age since. Some are sharp and clear like carved granite, others are blurred like faint scratches on birch bark, but together they form a chorus that hasn't ended. Today, runes live in strange places. You see them in fantasy novels and video games, glowing blue, in the hands of wizards. They show up on t-shirts, jewelry, tattoos, inked onto skin that will carry them to yet another century. People wear them not only for beauty, but because they feel powerful, like whispers of mystery clinging to their edges. Historians still argue whether these modern uses honor the past or reinvent it entirely, but either way, the runes are alive. One quirky modern tidbit: in parts of Scandinavia, farmers still used runic calendars well into the 20th century, long after printed almanacs were widely available. Imagine leaning over a wooden staff carved with symbols using the same system as ancestors 1,000 years before. The stubborn continuity makes you smile. It's like history hiding in plain sight, disguised as just how we've always done things. Fringe enthusiasts still claim runes hold secret codes, cosmic wisdom left unfinished. Some argue each rune has meanings that scholars haven't unlocked. Mainstream historians roll their eyes, pointing out that plenty of inscriptions are just names, jokes, or property marks, and yet the allure of the unfinished lingers. Even if you know the stone says Thor carved this, you can't help but wonder if Thor meant more than he let on. The unfinished quality is the rune's true gift. They never settled into a single purpose. They were alphabets, charms, doodles, monuments, graffiti. They belonged to farmers and kings, travelers and lovers, priests and pranksters. And because they were always both serious and playful, ordinary and magical, their meanings still feel open. They whisper but never shout. They leave you leaning closer, curious, as if the next stroke might finish the story. You sit back, feeling their presence fade into the air like breath on a winter morning. The runes don't demand answers. They leave you with questions. They linger, not because they solved mysteries, but because they became mysteries themselves. You realize their greatest power is that they're never quite finished. And now, as you lie back, let the pace slow. Imagine the runes fading into soft scratches, their lines gently dissolving into the texture of old stone. The harsh edges blur, the sharp meanings soften until they are nothing more than patterns like ripples on water, like the faint grain of wood beneath your fingertips. The Vikings who carved them are gone, the farmers who tallied with them are gone, the scholars who puzzled over them are gone. And yet the symbols remain patient, unhurried. They don't press you for understanding. They wait quietly like stars scattered across a night sky. You don't have to read them, you only have to let them be. Your breath slows. The whisper of history is no louder than the hum of a fan in the corner, no stronger than the weight of a blanket pulled close. The unfinished stories of runes match the unfinished thoughts in your mind. You don't need to finish them tonight. You can let them drift, let them stay open, let them become soft background music for your sleep. The world outside the window can keep its noise. Here inside this dim quiet you have ancient marks etched into eternity, patiently waiting for you to rest. Close your eyes. Let the runes fall silent. Let their whispers fade into nothing. Sweet dreams.